In a world where prejudice often blinds people to true humanity, one boy's courage will challenge the very essence of what it means to care for others. What if you were in the position to save a life, but the world around you told you it wasn't your responsibility? The bustling city street was alive with the usual chaos of the afternoon rush. The noise of honking cars, the chatter of busy pedestrians, and the rush of feet against the cracked sidewalk filled the air. People were preoccupied with their own worlds, lost in their phones, hurrying to work, or simply trying to make it through another long day. In the middle of it all, a 10-year-old black boy walked down the street, his small frame nearly swallowed by the sea of hurried adults. His brown pants and shirt, worn and stained from countless days on the streets, barely held together. His shoes were torn, his hair a mess, and his face showed signs of a life lived in survival mode. Yet despite it all, his eyes held a spark of something greater: hope, resilience, and a quiet but powerful determination to make it through. The boy had seen many things in his short life, things no child should ever have to witness. But none of that had hardened him. If anything, the years of struggle had softened his heart, made him more compassionate, more aware of the world around him. He had learned early on that survival was a lonely road, but that didn't mean he couldn't extend a hand to those who were also lost. As he walked along the sidewalk, scanning the crowd of people who seemed to brush past him without a second glance, something caught his eye. At first, it was a distant cry, soft, faint, but unmistakably a child's sob. He stopped in his tracks, the sound tugging at his chest. His eyes darted around, searching for the source of the cry. That's when he saw her. There, on the sidewalk, just ahead, was a baby. A small, blonde-haired girl, probably no older than a year or so. She sat alone in the middle of the street, her tiny hands pressed against the rough concrete, her face streaked with tears. She was wearing a simple white shirt, her feet bare against the hot pavement. A soft white blanket lay crumpled at her side, but she seemed to be completely alone. Her wide, terrified eyes searched the crowd, but no one seemed to notice her. The people around her walked by, completely oblivious to the child sitting there, her cries swallowed up by the noise of the city. The boy's heart dropped. He took a hesitant step toward her, his eyes scanning the crowd once more, hoping to find someone who might be her parent. But there was no one. Not a single person seemed to acknowledge the child. It was as if she didn't exist at all, just another invisible piece of the bustling city. The boy's mind raced. Should he move on? Was this even his problem? But as he looked down at the baby, sitting there so small and vulnerable, something deep inside him stirred. He couldn't walk away. Without another thought, the boy crouched down beside the baby. He gently scooped her up into his arms, the weight of her small body barely anything in his hands. She sniffled, her tears still fresh, and looked up at him with wide eyes, filled with confusion and fear. For a moment, the boy just held her, not knowing what to do next. He couldn't even imagine what could have brought this little girl to be alone in such a dangerous place. The boy's heart clenched with a mixture of sadness and anger. How could anyone let a baby be left here, abandoned in the middle of the street, with no one to protect her? It didn't matter who she was or where she came from. All that mattered was that she needed help, and the boy was the only one who had stopped to see her. He whispered softly to her, hoping to calm her down. "It's okay. I'm here. You're safe now." His words were simple, but they were enough to make the baby stop crying. She hiccuped, wiping her eyes with tiny fists, and looked up at him as if to ask, "Who are you?" The boy's eyes softened as he looked back at her. She had golden curls, soft and delicate, and her little face was a perfect picture of innocence. She wasn't like him. She didn't belong to his world. She had everything he didn't: wealth, privilege, comfort, safety. Yet none of that mattered. To the boy, she was just a child in need, and that was all that mattered. He looked around again, still hoping to see someone coming to claim her, but there was no sign of anyone looking for her. The boy's chest tightened. The baby's cries echoed in his mind. How had this happened? Who would leave a baby alone in the middle of a busy street? The boy stood up, holding her in his arms. He had to find someone to help, but who? Where? The city around him seemed to be a blur, people moving in every direction, but none of them were stopping to help. He looked down at the baby, still clutching her tightly against his chest. He could feel her warmth against his skin, her small hands clutching at the fabric of his brown shirt. For a moment, he felt a connection with her, as if their worlds, so different in every way, had somehow merged in this moment of need. He didn't know who this baby was, and he didn't know how he could fix this, but one thing was clear. He couldn't just leave her here. He had to do something. He had to help. With determination in his eyes, the boy began to walk, looking for the nearest place where he could find someone who might know what to do. The city, still oblivious to their shared moment, continued to buzz around them. But in the boy's heart, there was only one thing on his mind. This baby needed him. The boy's life had never been easy. His family lived in one of the roughest neighborhoods in the city, where the sound of sirens and shouting was a constant presence. It wasn't unusual to hear stories of crime or to witness petty thefts in broad daylight. His mother, a hard-working woman, tried her best to shield him from the harsh realities around them. She worked long hours cleaning offices and doing odd jobs for wealthy families, just to make ends meet. But the boy, despite the hardships, always kept his heart open. He had been taught early in life that kindness was something no one could take from you, no matter how little you had. His small apartment, with peeling paint and broken windows, was full of love and warmth. Even when there wasn't enough food on the table, his mother made sure that the boy always had something to smile about. In his world, people didn't look twice at him. He was just another poor black kid in a neglected neighborhood. But he didn't let that define him. His small, worn clothes, his brown pants and shirt, were a symbol of his resilience, not his worth. He knew that people around him might see him as invisible, but he refused to let their indifference affect his sense of self. He was a survivor, and he would always do what he could to help others, no matter how hard his own life became. Across the city, life was a stark contrast for the baby girl. She was the daughter of a wealthy billionaire family, surrounded by opulence and luxury from the moment she was born. The home she lived in was a grand mansion, with marble floors and chandeliers that sparkled like stars. But despite the comforts of her life, she was a stranger to the warmth of true affection. Her parents, cold and detached, spent little time with her. Their lives revolved around business deals, charity events, and the pursuit of more wealth. The baby was raised by nannies and servants who had little love to give, just the mechanical care needed to keep her alive. She lacked the connection that the boy had in his small, humble home. Her toys were the latest and most expensive, but her laughter was often hollow. Her world was built on privilege, but that didn't protect her from the harshness of life. One day, as the family went out for an extravagant shopping trip, a misfortune struck. The crowds in the city were thick, and the parents, as usual, were distracted, talking on their phones, engaging in business conversations with no attention to the child beside them. In the confusion of the busy street as they rushed through the crowds of people, the baby was suddenly separated from her parents. In the blink of an eye, the child slipped away from her mother's grasp, unnoticed. She cried out, but the sounds of the bustling city swallowed her voice. No one paid attention. The parents didn't even realize she was missing at first, too consumed in their own world of wealth and status. The baby stumbled through the crowd, her small hands reaching out, looking for something, someone, anything to latch onto in the unfamiliar chaos. Her innocent cries went unheard, ignored by the busy people who continued to walk past her. Meanwhile, the boy, with his head down as usual, was navigating his way through the crowded streets. His mind was focused on the everyday struggles of life, the kind of struggles that others wouldn't understand. He wasn't looking for anything special. He wasn't waiting for a moment of destiny. But then he heard the cries. They were soft at first, almost as if the baby's voice was lost in the sea of noise. But to him, they were unmistakable. He stopped dead in his tracks, scanning the crowd for the source of the sound. And there she was. The baby was sitting on the cold concrete, her tiny body trembling with fear. Her white shirt, once clean, was now stained with dirt from the pavement. Her blonde curls were tangled, and her little feet were bare against the rough ground. She was looking around frantically, but no one was stopping. People rushed by, absorbed in their own lives, not sparing a second glance at the helpless child sitting in the middle of the street. The boy's heart dropped as he watched her. His instincts kicked in, and he moved quickly toward her. He could see the fear in her wide, tear-filled eyes. She was so small, so vulnerable. The boy's hands trembled as he knelt down beside her. The disparity between them couldn't have been clearer. She was rich, privileged, and had never known a day of hunger or cold, while he had fought tooth and nail for everything he had. And yet, none of that mattered. She was just a child in need, and he could not turn away. He gently reached out and scooped her up into his arms, her tiny body fitting perfectly against his chest. She sniffled, wiping her nose on her tiny hands, and looked up at him with confusion, as though trying to make sense of the stranger holding her. The boy looked down at her with soft eyes, murmuring, "You're safe now. I'll help you." For a moment, the world around them disappeared. It didn't matter that he was a poor black boy, wearing ragged clothes, or that she was the daughter of a wealthy family who probably wouldn't even notice her absence. In that instant, all that mattered was that she was in his care. He would find someone to help, someone who could reunite her with her family. He wouldn't leave her alone. But as he scanned the streets, hoping to find someone, anyone, who might know her, his heart sank. No one was stopping. Everyone was too busy, too caught up in their own lives to notice the small, frightened child in his arms. The boy's chest tightened as he held her close. He couldn't leave her there. He wouldn't. And so, with a small, determined breath, the boy began to walk through the crowd, the baby held tightly in his arms, heading towards the unknown. The boy's hands were trembling as he held the baby close. She was so small, so fragile, her cries soft and pitiful. He glanced around quickly, his heart racing. The bustling city had swallowed up the sound of her distress, and it seemed that no one was paying attention. The streets were crowded, people rushing past him, too busy to notice the small, vulnerable child in his arms. A sense of urgency crept into his movements as he looked into her tear-streaked face. He murmured softly, trying to soothe her, But the more he did, the more he realized just how alone they both were. The baby's tiny fists grasped at the fabric of his brown shirt as if holding on for dear life. Her white shirt was stained with dirt, and her golden curls were a tangled mess. Her wide, scared eyes searched his face for some sign of reassurance. The boy didn't have much to offer in the way of comfort, but he gave her what he could. His heart ached with empathy. This wasn't his world, not really. He didn't belong in the circles of wealth and privilege that the baby did. He wasn't supposed to be her protector, but there was no way he could walk away from her now. He wouldn't. His eyes scanned the streets again, and the reality of the situation settled in. The crowd was moving at a fast pace, people talking into their phones, rushing to their next destination, barely giving the boy or the baby a passing glance. His heart sank as he realized that no one was stopping to help. A knot tightened in his stomach. His life, his neighborhood, he was used to being ignored, treated as though he didn't matter. But this was different. This was a baby, a child in need, a child who had no one to help her but him. He walked as quickly as he could, weaving through the crowd, trying to find someone who could help. But every time he reached out, every time he glanced at a passerby hoping for help, they ignored him. He could feel their indifference like an invisible wall. He could see the way people averted their gaze, the way they refused to acknowledge his presence. No one seemed to care. His clothes, his skin, his very existence, it was all an invisible mark against him. He wasn't worth the time or attention of these people. Despite the overwhelming sense of isolation, the boy refused to stop. The baby in his arms was all that mattered now. Her soft cries tugged at his heart, but he couldn't find the words to comfort her beyond gentle whispers. He needed to find help. He needed to get her to safety. Meanwhile, back at the billionaire family's mansion, panic was just beginning to set in. The baby's absence was noticed when a nanny came running into the lavish living room, frantic and breathless. "Where's the baby? She's not in her crib." The woman's voice trembled, her eyes wide with fear. The mother, who had been lounging lazily on the sofa, barely glanced up from her phone. "She's probably just wandered off somewhere. Call the security team and have them find her. We'll be fine." Her tone was dismissive, casual, as though the disappearance of her child was just another inconvenience, nothing more. The father, too, barely raised an eyebrow. His attention was still glued to the latest business transaction flashing across his screen. "Do we have any private security nearby?" he asked, as if it was no more important than an office memo. "Get them on it. We can't have our daughter's picture plastered all over the news." There was no sense of urgency, no fear, not even a moment of human connection. The thought of searching for their child themselves didn't even cross their minds. It was easier to throw money at the problem, to use their resources to outsource their parental responsibilities to people they barely knew. As the boy continued walking through the streets with the baby in his arms, he could hear the distant hum of sirens, the sound of the city continuing its endless rush. But he was still alone in this moment. No one was coming to help him. No one was coming to help the baby. And the longer he walked, the heavier the weight on his chest grew. He had never felt so invisible, so rejected, as when he looked at the indifferent faces that walked past him without a second thought. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. He had to do something. He had to save this baby, even if the world refused to see her, even if the world refused to see him. He passed by storefronts, his eyes scanning for someone who might care, someone who might be able to help. His mind raced with ideas, but none of them felt like the right one. Every turn he made seemed to bring him deeper into the maze of the city, and the longer he walked, the more he realized just how much of a stranger he was in this world. No one cared. No one saw him, or the baby, or anyone like them. Finally, he reached a small corner cafe where the owner knew him by sight. He stepped inside, breathless, his eyes searching the faces of the few patrons. The boy rushed up to the counter, cradling the baby tightly. "Please," he begged, his voice shaking. "Can you help me find someone? She's lost. She's scared." The cafe owner, an older woman with soft eyes, glanced down at the baby in his arms. Her face softened, and for the first time that day, the boy felt seen. She immediately reached for her phone, her hands moving with practiced ease as she dialed for help. As the woman spoke into the phone, the boy's heart finally began to slow, but it was still beating hard in his chest. They were taking action. Someone was listening. Outside, the billionaire family was still oblivious, too distracted to even begin to understand that their daughter was safe in someone else's hands, the hands of a boy who had nothing but everything to give. As the boy continued to move through the city, his grip on the baby tightened. The baby had stopped crying, her small body still in his arms, but the weight of the situation pressed down on him. He was far from home, far from any safety net, but he wasn't going to stop. He had to get the baby to someone who could help. Every step he took was a step away from the life he knew, but it felt like the only right thing to do. As he walked, he heard the screech of tires. He turned and his heart raced as a car came barreling toward him. The sound of the engine and the tires skidding on the wet pavement filled his ears. In that moment, everything seemed to slow down. His instincts screamed at him to move, but there was nowhere to go, no time to think. He was in the middle of the crosswalk, the baby still cradled in his arms, as the car hurtled toward him with no sign of slowing down. Without thinking, he leapt. With a burst of adrenaline, he lunged to the side, his body moving with a speed he didn't know he had. He rolled across the sidewalk, narrowly avoiding the car's front bumper, as it came to a screeching halt just inches away. The car's tires screeched, the driver's horn blared, but the boy didn't stop. He quickly got to his feet, still holding the baby securely, and without missing a beat, he kept moving, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't look back. For the first time, people in the crowd noticed him. A few bystanders gasped, others whispered, but all of them watched as the boy continued his path, determined. It wasn't just the near miss with the car that had caught their attention. It was the sight of a young child, cradled in the arms of a boy who clearly had nothing but a sense of duty and compassion. There was no hesitation in his actions, no thought for his own safety. The boy was simply doing what needed to be done, despite the dangers, despite the odds. His bravery was undeniable. In the distance, sirens wailed. The police had been called, and soon they arrived at the scene. Their cars screeched to a halt beside the boy, who had managed to find a small bench at a nearby park to sit down and catch his breath. The baby, still in his arms, was calm now, her soft eyes blinking up at him. She trusted him completely, and he wouldn't let her down. Moments later, the billionaire couple arrived, escorted by a team of private security and police officers. They looked frantic, their expensive clothes disheveled, their faces a mix of fear and anger. The mother, her eyes wide with terror, rushed toward the boy. "Where is my baby?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The boy stood up, holding the baby out to her. "She's safe," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "I found her. I made sure she was okay." The father, a tall man in a sharp suit, stepped forward with a scowl. He eyed the boy suspiciously, his gaze lingering on the boy's brown shirt and pants. He could hardly believe what he was seeing. A poor, black child, someone from a world completely different than his own, was the one who had saved his daughter. He couldn't fathom it. His brow furrowed as he took a step back. "Did you take her?" the father demanded, his voice sharp and filled with distrust. "What do you want from us?" The boy, unfazed by the question, shook his head. "I didn't take her. She was lost. I just found her. I'm not looking for anything. I just wanted to help." The mother stood there, still trembling, unsure of what to say. The tension in the air was thick with suspicion. The boy's actions, though brave, had sparked a deep distrust in the parents. They had never once considered that someone from a background like his could save their daughter. To them, people like the boy were only trouble, and the idea that he had acted out of pure goodness seemed foreign to them. The police officer on the scene stepped forward and tried to calm the situation, asking the boy to explain what had happened. The boy remained calm, recounting the events from the moment he had seen the baby alone on the street. His words were simple, yet they held a quiet confidence. He didn't want recognition. He didn't want rewards. All he wanted was for the baby to be safe, and that was all he cared about. But the turning point came when the security footage from a nearby store was pulled up. On the screen, the events from just moments earlier were laid out in front of everyone. The footage showed the boy carrying the baby as he carefully avoided the speeding car. It showed him making the split-second decision to save the child, stepping out onto the street without hesitation, risking his own life to ensure hers. There was no malice in his actions. He was simply doing what was right, without thought for himself. As the footage played, the parents' expressions shifted. The disdain on the father's face faded, replaced by disbelief. He was seeing, in real time, the truth of what had happened. This wasn't a boy looking to exploit a situation. This was a child with a heart so full of courage that it had moved the world around him. The mother's face softened as she looked down at her daughter, then back at the boy. The coldness in her eyes melted away. For the first time, she saw him, really saw him, not as the other, but as a human being who had done something extraordinary. She approached the boy slowly, her hands shaking, as she reached out to gently take the baby from him. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but filled with gratitude. The boy nodded, but his expression remained unchanged. He had done what he had to do, and now it was time to let them go. As the boy stood in the park, watching the billionaire couple hold their baby close, he couldn't shake the feeling of disbelief. Everything had happened so quickly. One moment, he was simply trying to do what was right, and now his actions had changed the course of not only his life, but the lives of the people around him. The billionaire parents, still reeling from the revelation of how the boy had saved their daughter, looked at each other in silence. The shock on their faces had given way to an uncomfortable realization. The man, once so full of disdain for people like the boy, now found himself questioning his entire worldview. He had always believed in the divide between people like him, wealthy, privileged, and people like the boy, poor, from the wrong side of town. To him, the boy had always been invisible, just another face in a crowd that could be ignored. But now, that very child had done something none of the others around them had done. He had saved their daughter, putting her life above his own without asking for anything in return. The weight of this realization was heavy. The man's chest tightened as he thought about how he had judged the boy based on his race and his economic status. He had assumed that a child like this had no worth, that he didn't deserve the attention of people like them. He had been wrong, horribly wrong. The woman, on the other hand, held her daughter tightly, her mind racing. She had never once considered that someone like the boy could be capable of such selflessness. Her world had always been one of privilege, surrounded by luxury and comfort. Her life had been filled with everything material she could ever want, but it had been devoid of true connection, true love. It had taken a child who had nothing to open her eyes to what truly mattered. And in that moment, as she looked at the boy, she saw not a poor kid from the street, but a young person with a heart bigger than anything she could have imagined. She walked over to the boy, her steps tentative but sure. He was still holding the baby, gently rocking her in his arms. His eyes were downcast, but when he felt her approach, he lifted his gaze. There was no fear in his eyes, only a quiet determination, as though he had already made peace with whatever would come next. "I don't know how to thank you," the woman said softly, her voice filled with emotion. "What you did for our daughter, there are no words." The boy simply nodded, his eyes not meeting hers. He wasn't looking for gratitude, for applause. He was just doing what anyone in his shoes would have done. "You've done more than anyone could have asked for," the man added, his voice quieter now, more reflective. "And we realize we've been so wrong. About you, about the way we see people. You're not just a boy from the streets, you're a hero. You saved our daughter's life." The boy was silent, still processing their words. He wasn't used to hearing this kind of talk, especially from people who had lived lives that felt so distant from his own. But there was something in their voices, a sincerity that had not been there before. The woman took a deep breath, and then she spoke again, this time with a weight to her words. "We want to offer you something that could change your life." The boy's eyebrows furrowed in confusion. He didn't understand what she meant. He hadn't done this to get anything. He had simply wanted to help. "We want to offer you a better life," the man said, stepping forward. "We're offering to adopt you. We want you to have the kind of opportunities, the kind of love that we failed to give our own daughter. You deserve it." The boy froze, his grip on the baby tightening for a brief moment. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Adopt him? He looked up at the couple, unsure if they were serious. He had heard of people adopting children, but this felt like a dream he had never dared to imagine. The life he had lived, the struggle, the hardship, all of it had shaped who he was. He had never expected anyone to offer him something so monumental. "I don't know what to say," he murmured, his voice filled with awe and hesitation. "Why me?" The woman smiled softly, her eyes full of warmth. "Because you're the kind of person who sees people for who they really are. You didn't judge our daughter by how much money she had or by the color of her skin. You just saw a child who needed help. And that's what matters." The boy's heart swelled. He had never thought of himself as someone special. He had just tried to do what was right. But now, it felt like something bigger than him was at play. "I don't want to leave my mom," he said quietly, his voice tinged with sadness. He thought of his mother, who had worked so hard to give him everything she could. He loved her more than anything, and the thought of being separated from her was painful. "We understand," the man said gently, "and we won't ask you to choose between us and your mother. But we want to give you a chance, a real chance, to live a life that's full of opportunities. A chance you might not get otherwise. The boy thought for a moment. He knew the life he had was full of struggles, but it was also full of love. He looked at the baby in his arms, and then back at the couple. This wasn't just a chance for him, it was a chance for a different future. And maybe, just maybe, it was a chance to bring more people together, to heal some of the divides that had torn people apart for so long. He looked up at them, his eyes steady. "I'll accept," he said quietly, "but I'm not leaving my mom. I'll figure out a way to bring her with me." The woman nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "We'll make sure she's taken care of. You have our word." And so, in that moment, the boy's life changed forever. He had gone from a child just trying to survive in a world that didn't seem to care, to someone with a future full of possibilities, all because of one act of kindness, one decision to care for someone else, no matter who they were or where they came from. The world had never seemed so full of promise. This story serves as a powerful reminder of how a single act of kindness can shatter the walls of prejudice and change the course of lives forever. The boy, with nothing but his heart and the instinct to protect, showed the world what true heroism looks like. His compassion toward the baby, a child from a completely different world, was not only an act of bravery but a display of empathy that transcended race, wealth, and status. In that moment, the boy didn't see the baby as a privileged child or a person with a different life. He saw her as a child in need, a fellow human being whose life mattered. It was this simple truth that spoke volumes to those who had the power to change his life. The story also highlights the transformation of the billionaire parents. Before this incident, their world was one of privilege, built on assumptions and prejudices. They had never been forced to confront the idea that their wealth and status did not give them the right to devalue others. Their lives had been insulated by money, power, and the idea that some people were worth more than others based on their circumstances. But when they witnessed the boy's selflessness, their understanding of what it means to be human was completely upended. The boy, someone they would have otherwise overlooked, saved their daughter's life, and, in doing so, saved them from their own ignorance. This shift in perspective, from seeing the boy as a mere street child to recognizing his bravery and inherent worth, is a reminder of how easily our biases can cloud our judgment. It's easy to make assumptions about others based on appearances or the circumstances into which they were born. But, as the story shows, true worth is not determined by race, class, or background. It is defined by actions, by the heart, and by the kindness we choose to show to others. The boy's actions were not born of expectation or desire for reward, but from the simplest human instinct to help. For the boy, the act of saving the baby was never about what he could get in return. It was about doing what was right, regardless of the consequences. In a world where people often turn a blind eye to the suffering of others, he did not hesitate to act, to step up and make a difference. His bravery, which had been a quiet, everyday act of survival until that moment, became a beacon of hope, showing that even the most marginalized can stand tall and make a lasting impact on the world. The boy's courage did not just affect his own life. It also caused a ripple effect, one that transformed the lives of the billionaire family. What seemed like an act of sheer luck, a random meeting between two completely different worlds, became a moment of awakening. The couple realized that the divide between them and the boy was not something that could never be bridged. In fact, their newfound understanding created a bond, a promise to see the boy for who he truly was, a hero, someone deserving of opportunity and care. This shift in perception is what makes this story so impactful. It challenges us to reflect on how we view others, how our biases shape our actions, and how we might treat someone differently if we truly saw them for who they are, not for what they have or where they come from. It calls us to reflect on the power of empathy, the transformative power of kindness, and the way one person's actions can inspire others to change. The boy didn't have to do what he did, but he did it anyway, and in doing so, he changed everything. This story teaches us that we all have the power to challenge our biases, to step outside the walls we've built around ourselves, and to treat others with the dignity and respect they deserve. One act of kindness, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, can indeed change someone's entire worldview. By choosing to see people as they are, not as we perceive them to be, we can make a lasting difference in the world. Viewer engagement. Question: what does this story teach us about empathy and how we treat people from different walks of life? Can one act of kindness change someone's entire worldview? How can you apply this lesson in your own life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Location: a bustling city park. The boy, dressed in brown pants and a brown shirt, is holding the baby in a white shirt. The billionaire parents, in formal attire, stand near them, watching the scene unfold with growing understanding. The surroundings are busy, but the focus is on this moment of transformation.